What if a single act of kindness could save the world? Imagine a quiet morning in a small town, where a simple gesture spirals into a mystery that could change the fate of humanity. Meet Daniel Carter, a 38-year-old veteran whose disciplined life in the quaint town of Willow Creek is about to take an extraordinary turn. With a scarred arm from his days in the Marines and a heart still yearning for purpose, Daniel's routine is shattered when he helps an elderly woman with her groceries, only to find military jets roaring over her house the next day. Put yourself in Daniel's shoes, a retired soldier now facing a cosmic conspiracy. What would you do next? Option 1. Dig deeper into the mystery, risking everything to uncover the truth. Option 2. Step back, hoping it's all a misunderstanding. Comment your choice below 1 or 2, and let's see what you do. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories for more gripping tales that pull you into the heart of the action. Daniel Carter woke before his alarm, a habit carved into his bones from 15 years in the Marines. His modest one-bedroom apartment in Willow Creek wasn't much, but after 3 tours in Afghanistan and Syria, having a quiet space felt like a palace. Everything was in order with military precision. Clothes folded into perfect squares, shoes angled at exactly 45 degrees, bed so tight you could bounce a coin off it. At 38, his face bore the rugged marks of too many days under scorching desert suns. A jagged scar on his left forearm whispered of a near-fatal ambush during his final tour, a story he kept locked away, even from himself. 3 years into civilian life, Daniel still held on to his military physique with daily 6-mile runs and a grueling workout routine. Old habits clung to him like a second skin. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee so strong it could wake the dead, another Marine ritual. Through his window, he watched Willow Creek's main street stir to life. The town, with its 12,000 residents, was the kind of place where everyone knew your name. Daniel had chosen it for that very reason. The anonymity of big cities left him uneasy after years of knowing every member of his unit like family. By 7:10 a.m., he was dressed in his work uniform, tan pants and a navy polo with Willow Creek Veteran Services stitched on the chest. The center had become his lifeline after struggling to find meaning post-military. As the outreach coordinator, he helped veterans navigate the maze of VA benefits, secure housing, or sometimes just offered a listening ear from someone who'd walked the same path. His old Ford Bronco coughed to life after a stubborn moment, a survivor like him, refusing to quit. He kept the radio off during his commute, savoring the silence, a stark contrast to the chaos of his past. The Veteran Services office sat in a restored Victorian house on Maple Street, its elegant structure a quiet promise of stability for the veterans who walked through its doors. Daniel unlocked the entrance, immediately checking the answering machine for messages from veterans needing help with claims. As he brewed a pot of coffee for the office, his thoughts drifted to yesterday afternoon. He'd been leaving Harper's Market when he spotted an elderly woman struggling with her bags in a sudden rainstorm. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, juggling an umbrella and 3 heavy grocery bags. Instinct kicked in. He jogged over, offering to help. She'd seemed startled at first, then smiled warmly when he introduced himself. "What a kind young man," she'd said, her voice trembling with age, the rain pattering softly on her umbrella. "You must be military. My Edward was the same, always lending a hand. Air Force, 45 years. They'd chatted as he carried her bags 3 blocks to her home, the rain soaking through his jacket, the weight of the bags a comforting burden. He learned her name was Eleanor Brooks, a widow of 10 years. Her house had caught him off guard, a grand colonial with sprawling gardens, far too large for a woman living alone, the roses blooming defiantly despite the downpour. At her door, she'd insisted he take a freshly baked peach pie as thanks. "I always bake too much," she chuckled, her eyes crinkling with warmth, a habit from feeding a hungry pilot all those years. He'd accepted with a smile, the pie's sweet aroma lingering in his senses, thinking that was the end of their brief encounter. The phone's sharp ring snapped him back to the present, the sound jarring in the quiet office. "Veteran Services, Daniel speaking." "Daniel, it's Sheriff Harper," came the reply, the sheriff's voice tight with urgency. "There's someone here asking for you. Air Force, high-ranking. Says it's urgent." Daniel's pulse quickened, a familiar adrenaline surging through him. He wasn't just any veteran. He was a former Force Recon Marine, with 15 years in some of the world's most perilous corners. Those experiences were etched into his very being, and now he was facing a situation no combat manual could prepare him for. The sheriff's office was eerily quiet when Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, the air thick with an unspoken tension that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Deputy Lopez, a wiry man with a perpetual frown, nodded toward the conference room, his eyes darting nervously. "They're waiting for you." "Wouldn't say what it's about." Daniel squared his shoulders, his military posture returning instinctively in the presence of authority, though his stomach churned with a mix of curiosity and dread. He hadn't felt this on edge since his last mission in Syria, where every shadow could hide a threat. Inside, 3 Air Force officers stood as he entered, a general with 4 stars shining on his shoulders, their gleam catching the dim fluorescent light, and 2 colonels whose stern faces betrayed nothing. "Sergeant Carter," the general said, extending a hand, his grip firm and unyielding. "General Robert Marshall, United States Air Force. Thank you for coming." Daniel shook his hand, the calluses on his palm a reminder of years gripping a rifle. "It's just Daniel now, sir. I've been out for 3 years. Once a Marine, always a Marine," General Marshall said with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "This is Colonel Bennett and Colonel Hayes." The 2 officers nodded in greeting, their movements synchronized, almost mechanical, as if they'd rehearsed this moment. "What can I do for the Air Force, sir?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine like a cold draft. General Marshall studied him for a moment, his piercing blue eyes searching for something Daniel couldn't name. "You assisted an elderly woman yesterday, Eleanor Brooks." Daniel nodded slowly, the memory of the rain-soaked street flashing in his mind, the patter of droplets on his jacket, the weight of her grocery bags in his hands, the faint scent of peaches from the pie she'd given him. "Yes, sir. I helped her with her groceries." "Is Mrs. Brooks okay?" His voice carried a note of concern. He'd grown fond of the tiny woman in their brief encounter, her warm smile a rare comfort in his often solitary life. "She's fine," the general replied, exchanging a glance with the colonels that Daniel couldn't decipher, a silent conversation he wasn't privy to. "Better than fine, actually. What did you and Mrs. Brooks talk about during your walk?" Daniel thought back, the rain pattering on his memory, the sound of her quavering voice cutting through the downpour. "Nothing significant, sir. The weather, her late husband in the Air Force, her baking, just small talk." But as he spoke, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. Had there been something in her tone, a hidden meaning he'd missed? Colonel Bennett opened a folder with a crisp snap, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and Daniel's eyes caught a glimpse of classified stamps in red ink. Did she mention anything about her husband's service? Specific missions or programs? The colonel's voice was clipped, his gaze intense, as if he could see straight through Daniel's carefully neutral expression. "No, sir," Daniel replied, his mind racing. "Just that he served 45 years. He remembered Eleanor's pride as she spoke of Edward, the way her eyes had lit up despite the years of grief etched into her face. "Did she give you anything?" Colonel Hayes asked sharply, his tone cutting through Daniel's thoughts like a knife. "A peach pie, sir," Daniel said, confusion growing like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. The pie sat uneaten in his fridge, its golden crust a reminder of a simpler moment. Yet now, under the colonel's scrutiny, even that felt suspicious. "May I ask what this is about?" His voice held a note of frustration, the uncertainty clawing at his composure. General Marshall sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of secrets, and ran a hand over his jaw, the faint stubble rasping under his fingers. "Eleanor Brooks isn't just any widow, Sergeant Carter. Her husband, General Edward Brooks, was a key figure in our advanced aerospace program. He led Project Nebula for over 2 decades. Daniel kept his face neutral, though the name meant nothing to him, a void where knowledge should have been. His ignorance felt like a disadvantage, a gap in his defenses he couldn't afford. "This morning at 0900, the general continued, his tone hardening, his words precise as a sniper's shot. For F-15s conducted a flyover of Mrs. Brooks's residence. It wasn't scheduled by any official Air Force channel. Someone used authorization codes that haven't been active for 10 years. Daniel felt a chill, the room's warmth fading as if the air itself had turned against him. The roar of jet engines echoed in his memory, a sound he'd heard that morning while sipping his coffee, dismissed as routine, until now. "And you think this is connected to me helping her with groceries?" His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear he tried to suppress. "We don't know," Colonel Bennett interjected, his voice cold, analytical. "But the timing is suspicious. Yesterday, you assist her. Today, unauthorized military aircraft perform a precision maneuver over her home. Did you notice anything unusual about her house? Anyone watching or following her?" Colonel Hayes pressed, his eyes narrowing, searching for a crack in Daniel's story. Daniel thought carefully, the scent of rain and peach pie lingering in his mind, mingling with the memory of Eleanor's stately colonial home. "No surveillance that I noticed, but I wasn't looking for it," he admitted, his Marine training kicking in as he replayed the scene in his head. He'd been focused on her, on keeping her dry under his jacket as they walked, but now he wondered, had there been a shadow in the alley, a car idling too long? Her house was larger than I'd expect for someone living alone. Well-kept gardens, nothing suspicious. But as he spoke, a memory surfaced, a faint glint in her window, like sunlight reflecting off glass, or a lens. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it gnawed at him, a puzzle piece that didn't fit. General Marshall paced the small room, his boots echoing softly on the linoleum floor, each step a metronome to Daniel's racing thoughts. Eleanor Brooks holds knowledge of classified programs from the Cold War era. Her husband trusted her completely. While not officially briefed, she likely knows more about certain black projects than some of our current commanders. The general's words landed like a grenade, the implications exploding in Daniel's mind. "With respect, sir," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. She seemed like a sweet, elderly woman baking pies, not someone holding state secrets. The image of Eleanor, her frail hands offering him a pie, clashed violently with the idea of her as a keeper of military secrets, and the dissonance made his head spin. "The best cover there is," Colonel Hayes muttered, his voice low, almost a growl, and Daniel caught a flicker of something in his eyes, distrust or perhaps fear. The general continued, his tone urgent now. "We need your help, Sergeant. Mrs. Brooks refuses to speak with us directly. She distrusts current military leadership, but she asked for you by name when we tried to interview her about the flyover." Daniel blinked, surprise hitting him like a cold wave, his breath catching in his throat. "Me? What?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications he couldn't yet grasp. "That's what we'd like to find out," General Marshall said, his voice softening slightly, as if he sensed Daniel's turmoil. "Would you be willing to visit her again? Determine if she's in danger or involved in this unauthorized activity." Daniel's mind raced, torn between duty and the quiet life he'd fought so hard to build. He thought of the veterans he helped, the ones who relied on him to navigate the VA's labyrinth. Could he abandon them for this? But the memory of Eleanor's sharp eyes, the weight of her trust, pulled him in the other direction. Before he could respond, Sheriff Harper knocked and entered, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the doorframe. "Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this," the sheriff said, his voice tight with urgency. He turned on the small TV in the corner, the screen flickering to life with a local news broadcast. Live footage showed 4 fighter jets performing intricate maneuvers over the town square, their sleek forms slicing through the sky with a precision that made Daniel's heart pound. The roar of their engines vibrated through the screen, a sound that echoed the chaos of his military years, and for a moment, he was back in Syria, the sky above him alive with danger. "That's happening right now," the sheriff said grimly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those jets just buzzed the entire town at low altitude. The FAA is losing it." General Marshall's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he barked orders into his phone, his voice a controlled storm. "I want those aircraft identified and grounded immediately. How the hell did they get authorization for a second flyover?" The room buzzed with tension, the air crackling with unspoken questions, and Daniel felt the weight of every eye on him, as if he held the key to a lock he couldn't see. Daniel watched the precision flying with a trained eye, his heart pounding like it did during his first combat mission, the adrenaline a familiar friend he hadn't missed. "Those aren't F-15s, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos, drawing every gaze to him. Everyone turned, their expressions a mix of surprise and alarm. The aircraft in the footage, they're not F-15s like this morning. The wing configuration is different. He pointed to the screen, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest. I can't identify the model, but they're not standard Air Force fighters. The colonels exchanged alarmed glances, their faces pale, and General Marshall ended his call with a sharp snap of his phone. Carter's right. Command confirms no U.S. military aircraft are authorized within 200 miles of this airspace today. None. Those are not our planes. The words hung in the air like a death knell, and Daniel felt the room tilt, the ground beneath him unsteady as the implications sank in. Unidentified aircraft, here, in Willow Creek. What had he stumbled into? The room fell silent, tension thick as smoke, and Daniel's mind raced. His marine instincts screamed to act, to take control, but years of civilian life urged caution, whispering that he was out of his depth. The line between duty and self-preservation felt razor thin, a tightrope he wasn't sure he could walk. He thought of a moment in Afghanistan, when he'd hesitated a second too long, nearly costing his squad their lives. The guilt still haunted him, a shadow that followed him into every decision. He couldn't make the same mistake now, not when the stakes were so unclear, yet so immense. The unknown aircraft completed a final pass over the town square, their engines a deafening roar even through the TV, before banking sharply westward, vanishing into the clouds like ghosts. Unidentified aircraft in U.S. airspace, Colonel Bennett muttered, his voice a mix of disbelief and dread, his hands clenching into fists. This is a national security incident now. General Marshall turned to Daniel, his expression grave, his eyes searching. We need to speak with Eleanor Brooks immediately. She may be the key to understanding what's happening here. As they prepared to leave, Daniel's phone rang. The Veteran Services number, the familiar ringtone jarring in the tense atmosphere. Carter speaking, he answered, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Daniel, it's Sarah from the front desk, came the reply, her voice trembling, high-pitched with anxiety. There's an elderly woman here asking for you. Says her name is Eleanor Brooks. She seems upset. Daniel looked at the general, his heart sinking as the pieces of the puzzle began to click together, each one more unsettling than the last. Mrs. Brooks is at my office right now. 20 minutes later, Daniel entered the Veteran Services private counseling room, the faint scent of coffee and old wood greeting him as he stepped inside. Eleanor waited, a floral handbag clutched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. The general and his officers stayed in the lobby, agreeing Daniel should speak with her alone first, their voices a low murmur through the closed door. Mrs. Brooks, Daniel said, nodding respectfully, his voice soft to ease her tension, though his own nerves were frayed. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. The elderly woman's eyes, sharp and piercing despite her age, locked onto him, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force. Did you enjoy the pie, young man? Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency, a tremor that hadn't been there yesterday. I did, he replied, a small smile breaking through his nerves, the memory of the pie's sweet aroma of fleeting comfort. Thank you again. She nodded, satisfied, her lips curving into a faint smile. My Edward always said you could tell a person's character by whether they appreciated a properly made pie. Impatient people don't have the temperament for good baking or good flying. The words felt like a test, and Daniel wondered what she saw in him, what Edward's standards would have demanded. Daniel sat across from her, the chair creaking under his weight, the sound loud in the quiet room. Mrs. Brooks, there are some Air Force officers here who— I know exactly who's here, she interrupted, her voice suddenly firm, cutting through the air like a blade, her frail frame radiating an authority that made Daniel sit up straighter. Robert Marshall and his team. I've known Robert since he was a young lieutenant learning to fly under Edward's command. She leaned forward, her floral perfume mingling with the scent of old paper, her eyes narrowing slightly. But I didn't come to talk to them. I came to talk to you, because you're not part of it. Not compromised. Part of what, ma'am? Daniel asked, his stomach knotting with unease, the room feeling smaller with every word she spoke, the walls closing in as the mystery deepened. Eleanor opened her handbag with deliberate care, her movements slow but precise, and slid an old photograph across the table, the edges yellowed with age. It showed a group of Air Force officers standing in front of an aircraft unlike any Daniel had ever seen, sleek, black, with an unusual wing design that seemed to defy physics, its surface absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. "Edward's team, 1985, she said, her finger tapping the aircraft in the background, her nail clicking softly against the photo. Project Nebula wasn't just about reconnaissance, as the public was told. It was about something far greater. Daniel studied the photo, his breath catching as he recognized the shape from the news footage, the sleek lines and strange angles unmistakable. These look like the aircraft flying over town today. His voice was barely above a whisper, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. She nodded, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and fear, the emotions warring in her gaze. Because they are. These planes were officially decommissioned in 1999, too costly, too controversial. All prototypes were supposedly destroyed. A thin smile crossed her face, tinged with defiance, a spark of the woman she must have been when Edward was alive. Edward didn't trust that decision. He kept one squadron operational, off the books. Daniel felt a chill, his mind reeling as the implications sank in, each one heavier than the last. "You're saying your husband hid experimental aircraft from the government?" His voice trembled, the weight of the secret pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Not from the government, young man," she corrected, her voice steady, unyielding. "For the government. Insurance, he called it." Her gaze hardened with conviction, her frail hands steady as she clasped them in her lap. "Edward believed we'd need them someday. And judging by the message I received yesterday, that day has come." "What message?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of her words pressing against his chest like a physical force, his heart pounding in his ears. "You," she said simply, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. "When you helped me cross that street, you spoke a code phrase without realizing it." Daniel blinked, confusion swirling like a storm, his mind scrambling to make sense of her words. "I don't understand." "When you introduced yourself," she explained, her voice softening slightly, as if she sensed his turmoil, "you said, 'Ma'am, let me help with those.'" Daniel Carter, former Marine. Edward established that exact phrase as an authentication code decades ago. Any military personnel using those words when approaching me would be recognized as sent by someone within the old Nebula network. The revelation hit Daniel like a tidal wave, his breath catching as he replayed the moment in his mind. The rain, her smile, his casual introduction. Had it really been a coincidence, or was something larger at play? Daniel shook his head, his heart pounding, the room spinning as he tried to anchor himself in the moment. "Mrs. Brooks, that was a coincidence. I was just being polite." His voice cracked, the uncertainty eating at him. The idea that his simple act of kindness could have triggered something so monumental too much to process. "Perhaps," she conceded, her tone softening, a flicker of doubt in her eyes that mirrored his own. "But the odds of a Marine using that exact phrasing right now, when Nebula signals are being detected again," she shrugged, the gesture small but heavy with meaning, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Edward didn't believe in coincidences when it came to national security. Daniel pulled out his phone with shaking hands, showing her the news footage of the aircraft, the sleek black shapes slicing through the sky. "These planes flew over town just minutes ago. Are you saying they're responding to me helping you yesterday?" His voice was tight, the question a lifeline in the chaos of his thoughts. "They're acknowledging receipt of what they believe was an activation code," she said, reaching into her bag again with a slow, deliberate motion that made Daniel's pulse quicken. This time, she pulled out a small leather journal, its pages worn but meticulously kept, the leather cracked with age but the binding still strong. Edward's contingency protocols. The Nebula Squadron would only be reactivated under specific circumstances, an imminent threat that conventional forces couldn't handle. "What kind of threat?" Daniel asked, his voice tight, the room feeling smaller with every word, the air thick with the weight of the unknown. Eleanor's expression grew distant, her eyes clouded with memories of warnings ignored, her voice dropping to a whisper. The kind Edward and his team spent decades preparing for, while others called them paranoid. The kind that's been slowly infiltrating key positions in military and government. The kind that doesn't come from any nation on earth. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold, and Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, his reality fracturing as the impossible became real. Daniel felt his worldview tilt, the ground beneath him unsteady, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he struggled to process her words. "Mrs. Brooks, are you suggesting?" His voice trailed off, the question too big, too terrifying to finish. "I'm not suggesting anything, young man," she said firmly, placing the journal in front of him with a soft thud, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "I'm telling you what my husband devoted his life to. Edward identified non-terrestrial technology in 1979. His team reverse-engineered enough to create the Nebula craft, our first defense against an eventual confrontation." Daniel's mind flashed to a moment in Syria, when he'd carried a wounded comrade's gear under fire, instinct overriding fear, the weight of the man's life in his hands. That same instinct now screamed that this was real, and far bigger than him, far bigger than anything he'd ever faced. The journal sat between them, a Pandora's box of secrets, and Daniel felt the weight of it, the responsibility it carried, pressing down on him like a physical force. A pause, the narrator's voice warm with emotion, cuts through the tension. This story makes us reflect on human nature. In a world drowning in negativity, people like Daniel still exist, those who step up when others step back. Have you ever witnessed an act of heroism in your life? Comment, "I've seen heroism," and share your story. The Daily Narrated Stories community loves hearing your real-life experiences, and I read every comment. Daniel repeated carefully, "Non-terrestrial?" His voice was a whisper, the word foreign on his tongue, the implications too vast to grasp. Before Eleanor could elaborate, the door opened with a sharp creak, and General Marshall entered, his patience clearly worn thin, his face a mask of frustration and urgency. "Eleanor, we need to talk about those aircraft." His voice was a low growl, the tension in the room spiking as he stepped inside, his presence a storm cloud ready to break. Eleanor straightened in her chair, transforming from a frail widow into a woman of unshakable authority, her spine rigid, her eyes blazing with a fire Daniel hadn't seen before. "Robert, still as impatient as when Edward was teaching you to fly the State Route 71, she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. The general's expression softened slightly, a flicker of nostalgia in his eyes, a brief glimpse of the man beneath the uniform. "This is a serious security breach, Eleanor. Experimental aircraft conducting unauthorized maneuvers over civilian populations." His voice was tight, the weight of his position evident in every word, but Eleanor was unmoved. "They weren't unauthorized," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his, her authority absolute. "They were following protocols established by the Joint Chiefs in 1990, which have never been officially rescinded." The room fell silent, the air crackling with the clash of wills, and Daniel felt caught in the middle, a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. Colonel Bennett entered with a tablet, his face grim, his movements hurried as he handed the device to the general. "Sir, we've tracked the aircraft to an abandoned airfield in the Adirondacks. Satellite shows they've gone underground, some kind of hangar system that doesn't appear on any official maps." The words sent a jolt through Daniel. The image of hidden aircraft burrowed beneath the earth, both thrilling and terrifying. General Marshall looked at Eleanor, his expression a mix of suspicion and awe. "How many are there?" "A full squadron," she replied, gesturing to the journal in front of Daniel, her voice steady, unyielding. 12 aircraft, maintained and ready. Everything Edward established is in there, including authentication codes only I can verify." The general reached for the journal, his hand steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty, but Eleanor placed her hand firmly on it, her frail fingers surprisingly strong. "Not yet, Robert," she said, her voice unyielding, her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. "First, we need to establish whether you're still working for the interests Edward sought to protect." His face hardened, a flash of anger in his eyes, but there was something else there too. Doubt, perhaps, or fear. "I've served this country loyally for 35 years, he said, his voice low, controlled. but the strain was evident, the weight of her accusation pressing down on him. The country, yes, she countered, her voice sharp, unyielding. But are you serving humanity? She turned to Daniel, her gaze piercing, and he felt the weight of her trust, the responsibility she was placing on him, heavy as a lead weight. That's why we need an outsider, someone with military experience, but not part of the Air Force chain of command. Someone who can objectively evaluate the situation. Daniel felt out of his depth, the weight of her words pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. With respect, ma'am, I'm just a veteran services coordinator. This sounds like something for higher authorities, he said, his voice trembling with the uncertainty that gnawed at him, the fear that he wasn't enough for this, that he'd fail when it mattered most. Eleanor smiled patiently, her eyes warm but resolute, a flicker of the grandmotherly kindness he'd seen yesterday shining through the steel. That's precisely why it must be you. The higher authorities have been compromised to varying degrees. Her words sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. The idea of infiltration at the highest levels both terrifying and surreal. She turned back to General Marshall, her voice steady, commanding. Tell him about the anomalies, Robert. The general hesitated, his jaw tightening, then sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair, the gesture weary, defeated. For the past 20 months, our early warning systems have detected increasing numbers of unidentified objects entering Earth's atmosphere. Objects with capabilities far beyond known technology, he said, his voice low, the admission a confession he hadn't wanted to make. The official position is that these are sensor malfunctions or natural phenomena. The general continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the lie. But you don't believe that, Daniel said, reading the tension in Marshall's face, the way his eyes darted away, unable to meet his gaze. No, the general admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, the confession a crack in his armor. Neither did Edward Brooks 30 years ago. He led a classified program studying similar incidents during the Cold War. His theories weren't well received by military leadership. The Nebula aircraft were developed based on technology his team studied, technology not of human origin. Eleanor nodded, her expression solemn, her hands steady as she clasped them in her lap. The program was officially terminated, all research confiscated. But Edward anticipated this. He created a contingency plan, a separate squadron hidden from official records, maintained by trusted personnel who shared his concerns. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And now they're flying over Willow Creek, Daniel concluded, his voice steady despite the storm in his mind, the realization settling over him like a heavy cloak. Why? Because of this, Eleanor said, opening her handbag once more with a slow, deliberate motion that made Daniel's pulse quicken, the anticipation a living thing in his chest. She removed what looked like an ordinary flash drive, its black plastic casing unremarkable, but the weight of her gaze told him it was anything but. Edward's complete research, including evidence of what he called the infiltration, entities that look human but aren't. He identified 3 within military leadership before they forced his program to shut down. General Marshall stared at the drive, his jaw tight, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Eleanor, if what Edward suspected is true, it is, she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction, her eyes blazing with a fire that belied her age. And it's worse now. The transmissions Edward's equipment detected have increased tenfold in the past month. Something is coming. She turned to Daniel, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable, as if she could see straight through to the fears he tried to hide. When you helped me yesterday, the Nebula pilots believed their activation protocol had been initiated. They conducted the flyover as acknowledgement. Once they realized I hadn't actually activated them, they performed the second flyover, their way of demanding clarification. Her words were a lifeline in the chaos, a thread of understanding in a tapestry of mystery, but they also deepened the fear that gnawed at him, the sense that he was in over his head. And now, Daniel asked, his voice tight with the weight of the unknown, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together, trying to anchor himself in the moment. Now we need to give them proper orders, she said. fixing General Marshall with a penetrating stare, her voice steady, unyielding. But first, we need to determine who among current leadership can be trusted. The general straightened his shoulders, his posture rigid, his face a mask of determination. I can assemble a small team. People I personally vouch for, he said, his voice firm. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in his confidence that Daniel couldn't miss. Not good enough, Eleanor replied firmly, her voice cutting through his, her authority absolute. Edward established a verification method that doesn't rely on personal judgment. It's in the journal. Daniel looked down at the leather-bound book, its pages filled with Edward Brooks's meticulous handwriting. Pages that potentially held secrets about non-human intelligence and a hidden squadron of advanced aircraft. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence had literally flown overhead. The roar of those jets a testament to the truth of her words. If I help you with this, Daniel said slowly, his voice trembling with the weight of the decision, the fear of failure a heavy weight in his chest. What exactly would I be getting involved in? Eleanor's expression was solemn, her voice soft but resolute, her eyes warm with a trust that both comforted and terrified him. The continuation of my husband's work, protecting humanity from a threat most people don't believe exists. These entities have been observing us for decades, occasionally interfering. Edward believed they were preparing for something larger. Recent events suggest he was right. Daniel's mind flashed to a moment in Afghanistan, when he'd hesitated a second too long, nearly costing his squad their lives, the guilt a constant companion that whispered in his ear. He couldn't hesitate now, not when the stakes were this high, not when Eleanor's trust in him was so absolute. The journal sat between them, a silent challenge, and Daniel felt the weight of it, the responsibility it carried, pressing down on him like a physical force. The narrator's voice, thick with awe, interjects softly. Incredible, isn't it? Sometimes, the smallest actions have the greatest impact. Life is full of random coincidences, or perhaps it's destiny. Either way, what Daniel did by helping an elderly woman changed countless lives. 3 days later, Daniel stood alongside Eleanor and General Marshall on a hidden airfield in the Adirondack Mountains, the air crisp with the scent of pine and jet fuel. Before them, 12 sleek black aircraft stood in perfect formation, their designs unlike anything in the official Air Force inventory, their surfaces absorbing the light, giving them an otherworldly sheen. Nearby, a team of aging engineers and pilots, all former members of Project Nebula, awaited orders, their faces lined with years of secrecy and determination. The verification process had been grueling, a marathon of late nights and tense debates, following the protocols in Edward's journal with meticulous care. They'd identified 6 high-ranking military officials showing subtle behavioral anomalies consistent with what Edward had termed non-terrestrial influence, small tics, unnatural pauses in speech, a coldness in their eyes that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. More disturbingly, satellite data from the past 6 months revealed a pattern of atmospheric disturbances matching Edward's predictions for pre-invasion activity, a series of anomalies that painted a chilling picture of what might be coming. They were right to hide this squadron, General Marshall murmured, watching as technicians prepared the lead aircraft for a demonstration, their movements precise, practiced. If Edward was correct about infiltration at the highest levels, these planes would have been destroyed decades ago. The general's voice was low, almost reverent, and Daniel saw a flicker of respect in his eyes, a recognition of the legacy Edward had left behind. Daniel nodded, still processing the revelations, his mind a whirlwind of fear and awe. The journal detailed technology far beyond public knowledge, propulsion systems that defied physics, materials science that seemed otherworldly, and weapons designed to counter the capabilities of unidentified craft, their schematics a testament to Edward's genius and his paranoia. Why me? He finally asked Eleanor, his voice raw with vulnerability, the question a plea for understanding in a world that no longer made sense. Out of all the military personnel in the world, why did helping you cross a street make me part of this? The elderly woman smiled, her eyes warm with understanding, a flicker of the grandmotherly kindness he'd seen yesterday shining through the steel. It wasn't just helping me cross the street, Daniel. It was how you did it. You assessed the situation, acted decisively yet compassionately, and maintained situational awareness throughout. Edward always said the best pilots showed the same qualities on the ground as in the air. She patted his arm gently, her touch a grounding force in the chaos of his thoughts, her voice soft but firm. Besides, we needed someone untainted by Air Force politics, someone whose loyalty would be to the mission, not career advancement or institutional preservation. The lead Nebula aircraft powered up, its engine emitting a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through the ground. Unlike any conventional jet, the sound a living thing that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. As it taxied toward the runway, Colonel Bennett approached with a satellite phone, his face pale, his voice tense. "Confirmation from our verification team," he reported, his words clipped, urgent. "The anomalous signals are intensifying. Multiple objects on approach, currently beyond lunar orbit, but closing fast." General Marshall nodded grimly, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with the weight of the news. "How long until potential contact?" 72 hours at current velocity, Bennett replied, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the phone. Eleanor watched the Nebula aircraft take flight, its black silhouette vanishing against the sky, a shadow against the clouds that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Edward always said we'd have 3 days warning at most. Just enough time to deploy if we were prepared," she said, her voice steady, her eyes clear with determination. "And are we prepared?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his core, the uncertainty a constant companion that whispered in his ear. "Thanks to you." "Yes," she said, turning to him with clear, determined eyes, her trust in him a lifeline he clung to. "The Nebula Squadron alone can't stop what's coming, but it can buy us time to implement Edward's full protocol." He designed a resonance system that disrupts their communication network, potentially forcing them to abandon any coordinated action. General Marshall looked at Daniel, his expression serious, his eyes searching for something Daniel couldn't name. "We need someone to coordinate between the technical team and military response, someone both groups will trust," he said, his voice steady. But there was a weight to his words, a recognition of the burden he was placing on Daniel's shoulders. He extended his hand, holding commission papers bearing the presidential seal, the ink stark against the white paper. "The president has authorized me to offer you a temporary reinstatement to active duty, special assignment." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he took the papers, the weight of them heavy in his hands, a tangible reminder of the choice before him. Part of him longed for the simplicity of Willow Creek, the quiet mornings, the veterans he helped, the routine that had kept him sane. But the Marine in him couldn't walk away, couldn't ignore the call to duty that had defined his life for so long. 3 days ago, he'd been helping veterans with paperwork, a small act of service that had grounded him. Now, he was being asked to coordinate humanity's first official response to non-terrestrial entities, a mission that could determine the fate of the world. "This is bigger than military branches, bigger than countries," Eleanor said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and fear. "This is about the future of our species." In the distance, the Nebula aircraft performed maneuvers that defied aerodynamics, their sleek forms slicing through the sky with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, preparing for a mission decades in the making. Daniel thought of the veterans he worked with, the ones who'd fought their own battles, the ones who relied on him to be their advocate. He thought of the ordinary citizens of Willow Creek, going about their lives, unaware of what loomed on the horizon, their innocence a stark contrast to the danger he now faced. "I'll do it," he said simply, his voice steady with resolve. The decision a weight lifted, a path chosen, the fear still there but overshadowed by the determination that had carried him through every battle he'd ever fought. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the hangar of what was now officially designated Deep Space Monitoring Station Beta, the air humming with the quiet efficiency of a new era. The Nebula Squadron had successfully intercepted and disrupted the approaching craft, forcing them to retreat beyond Earth's orbit, their sleek forms a distant memory against the stars. Edward Brooks's resonance technology had proven effective, creating a defensive shield that now encircled the planet, a shimmering barrier monitored from facilities like this one, its glow a testament to humanity's resilience. Most of the world remained oblivious to how close they'd come to a very different future, the truth buried beneath layers of secrecy. The official story blamed the unusual aerial activity on advanced military exercises, the strange atmospheric phenomena on solar flares, a convenient lie that preserved the fragile peace of everyday life. Eleanor, now a special advisor to a newly formed multinational defense initiative, stood beside Daniel, her frail frame a stark contrast to the strength in her eyes. She watched as the next generation of pilots trained on simulator systems based on nebula technology, their laughter and determination a hopeful echo of the past. "Edward would be proud," she told Daniel, her voice soft with emotion, a tear glistening in the corner of her eye. "Not just of what we accomplished, but of how humanity is finally preparing together." Daniel nodded, his mind drifting to that rainy afternoon when he'd helped an elderly woman with her groceries, the patter of rain on his jacket a distant memory that now felt like a lifetime ago. That simple act of kindness had placed him at the center of humanity's greatest challenge, a ripple that had grown into a wave, reshaping the world in ways he could never have imagined. Sometimes, the smallest actions truly created the largest ripples, a truth that settled in his heart with a quiet, profound weight. This story reminds us that courage isn't always about grand gestures. It's about the quiet moments of decency that ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can't imagine. Daniel's journey shows us that real strength lies in stepping up when others walk past, in choosing compassion over indifference, in daring to act when the stakes are unknown. What small act of kindness have you witnessed or performed that created a ripple in your life? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've made a difference, no matter how small it seems, because every ripple counts, every moment matters. At Daily Narrated Stories, we believe in the power of these moments to inspire and uplift, to remind us of the goodness that still exists in the world. Stories like Daniel's show us that every choice matters, that every act of kindness can shape the future in ways we can't predict. Don't miss out on more tales of ordinary heroes becoming extraordinary. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community. Time is fleeting, and these stories are too powerful to miss. Comment, share, and let's celebrate the ripples of kindness together, right here on Daily Narrated Stories, where every story is a chance to connect, to reflect, to be inspired. A knock at the door. Daniel opened it and froze, his breath catching in his throat. A four-star general flanked by two officers stood on his porch, their uniforms crisp, their expressions grave. "Sergeant Carter, something you said yesterday may have activated a long-dormant protocol." Daniel blinked, his mind racing, the weight of the past 6 months pressing against him. All he'd done was help an old woman carry her groceries. So why were fighter jets flying over her house? And why was she asking for him by name?